Hello and welcome to another episode of the Revenue Revolution podcast sponsored by Jointflows. Today we're joined by Jesse Woodbury. Jesse is the co-founder of Sales Players and he's an extremely experienced enterprise seller as well. Welcome to the show. How are you today, Jesse?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, guys.
No, thanks for joining us. Really looking forward to this episode. We usually start off by having a little bit of an introduction for our listeners so they know who Jesse is and how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, happy to share. Hey, everyone out there who's listening and tuning in, Jesse Woodbury. I've got about a decade of experience working in the tech software startup category, mostly in sales and lead generation type roles. I've spent most of my career at early stage companies, early being seed series to, Series C fundraising. I was sharing with the guys off air that a couple of those companies have been acquired. One of those was acquired by a FANG company. And yeah, mostly spent time in early selling roles over the last 7 years or so. I've been pretty focused on enterprise and more strategic sales cycles. So that's doing, multiple six-figure deals, and in some cases, even a seven-figure deal in there. So working with large brands to, bring resources together on both sides of the house, that's internal and external, and, get some large ARR deals done for software companies.
Amazing. So obviously through all those acquisitions, you're now a millionaire living on a private island, right?
Yeah, this is a topic I wish I want to talk about more on is having been through a handful of exits and been part of a bunch of other companies that have exited. You'd think I'd have a nice Rolls Royce parked in the driveway or something, or at least a private island, right? But the way it is as an IC, an individual contributor in one of these companies, it doesn't always work out that way. I'm happy to say one of those exits put some nice retirement savings away for me, but outside of that, it's been maybe a couple of nice dinners or vacations, and that's about it. So I'm still here grinding, hoping that something is even bigger that I do in the future. Maybe that's the podcast. Maybe it's another
Yeah.
company to join. But yeah, after everybody gets paid on the investor side and on the founder's side, there's really not a lot left over for Mr. AE on the front line of the sales team.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, you've obviously played a big role in some of these exits as well with some of those deals, and I think that's probably a good place to start. We all know how selling has changed. You mentioned about bringing resources on both sides together, which I think is key and very aligned with what Jointflows does as well. So nice little plug there, which we don't typically do on the show. But talk a little bit to how that has changed. So, you've got a decade of experience or over a decade of experience even. How has the land of selling enterprise deals changed over that period of time?
Night and day different. When I started my career, this is crazy to think about, like back in 2012, 2013, when I launched my own software career. You have to think that there wasn't even that many people using LinkedIn to prospect. That's how much the world's really changed, because now everybody's on LinkedIn. They're either posting content or they're DMing people to try to get meetings and things like that. But when I started out, that wasn't the case. We were actually just using Outlook to cold blast people and things like that. But even more so over the last couple years, what I've seen as a huge change in the current macro economy is the need for way more people to be involved in a deal cycle. A handful of years ago, if I was selling a product to the marketing team, I could probably have a director of marketing or maybe the VP of marketing sign a fairly sizable contract, right? Up to a couple $100,000, dollars or euros in contract value. And nobody would blink or bat an eye at that. In 2024, most of my deals are now getting escalated all the way up to the CEO or the CFO, which is a huge change for enterprise sellers. Because if you've gone your whole career being a specialist in selling to marketing orgs or development orgs or operations or call center or whatever, you're not used to having to deal with the CFO or the CEO or even the COO, right? So that's
Mhm.
probably one of the biggest changes that I've seen just in the last, call it 2 years. And I think
Yeah.
it's a product of the economy that we're in right now. Companies are just being especially cautious. They don't want to over tool. They don't want to purchase something that's not the exact right fit for what they need. And so there's this extra layer of due diligence that's going all the way up to the C-suite.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how are you combating that, I guess? So I think from two different angles. How are you adjusting your approach in this? And then the other feedback that you get from enterprise sellers is that requests for a proof of value or proof of concept is like, multiplied exponentially as well. And for me, I'm not a big fan of proof of values or proof of concepts. You can avoid them, and we try to avoid them as much as we can. How do you overcome that challenge as well?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is you've got to go into a large deal cycle knowing that it's going to happen. Don't fool yourself. A lot of times, especially if you've got a leader who's more old school, they've been doing this for a long time, they might say, we probably don't need to even worry about the CEO, because they've sold decades that way where CEO, CFO didn't have to get involved. Don't fool yourself. Just know that if you're doing a contract right now in 2024 that's more than even like 150K or 200,000 in annual spend, you're probably going to have some C-level stamp on it. So go into the deal knowing that. Don't be naive. Don't stick your head in the sand and say, this time will be different. It won't be. You'll get to a point in the deal cycle where your champion will say, shoot, totally forgot to run this by the CFO. Now we have a whole nother set of demos and discussions and deep dives into this and that. So just, acknowledge it. The first step is, knowing that it's going to happen, right? And then from there, you have to be thinking from the very first conversation you have with the brand about the business case, because the CEO and the CFO, while they probably will love all the fun features and functionality and the cool integrations that you have out of the box and the implementation process and your amazing team, they ultimately only care about the business value, the impact, and the bottom line. So as you're doing discovery in the early stages, really put a special focus into, why does this matter? Why would a CFO care about this? Why would a CEO care about this? And some hints there are, CFO is going to, they're the bean counters, quote unquote. They care about the dollars and cents, right? So just be thinking about ways that your product saves money, makes money, or reduces risk. One of those three things. So just be writing those notes down throughout your discovery process. And if you're still unsure, ask your champion. You got to build a really strong champion in these deals where you can say, help me understand your point of view. When we go present this to your CFO, how are we going to show that our product reduces risk, saves money, or makes money? And a special emphasis on the saves money right now in this economy. Then for the CEO,
Absolutely.
how does the product drive the overall company vision, and how does it build a better brand? And I know you might be thinking, well, I sell, cloud streaming data to DevOps. Nobody thinks about how that improves the brand. You've got to find that perspective. You got to find that point of view and that angle. And even if you sell data streaming to DevOps professionals, there's probably some use case within the product that's going to actually improve the brand. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're trying to sell to Uber, and Uber needs your data streaming analytics platform, right? And you're thinking, how is this going to impact Uber's brand? Well, if your product can help them speed up the time that it takes to get a driver to your door or to the front of the bar where you're waiting, that's a good thing for the brand, right? Is faster service, faster response times, those sorts of things. So you've got to be crafting this story. It's a story. It's a narrative that you're putting together over the course of your discovery that says, our data streaming analytics can help Uber get to you a lot faster. And that's a good thing for your brand because your customers and your drivers want to get things done faster, right? So
Mm.
find the story. I have a background in journalism. I studied journalism in college, and what an amazing insight I found is that skill set has become very valuable, because in my college years, I learned how to tell a really good story using data, using, the facts that I do have, and then crafting an angle or a point of view, and then simplifying it down so that, a fifth grade reader can understand it. And not to say that CEOs and CFOs are fifth grade readers, but the more you can simplify something down to, a basic narrative, the easier it's going to be. So that's a pretty long-winded answer.
No, amazing.
You asked also how to get over like the ask or the request for a proof of value or a proof of concept. Unfortunately, it's really hard to overcome this one. It's possible, but I tend to actually lean into these because I see them as a way to get a commitment. One of the principles that I guide my book of business by, or my process by, is if you can get the enterprise companies you're working with to make commitments, even small commitments, starting with, can we get a demo scheduled? Can we get an NDA signed, right? Can we get, a new vendor questionnaire filled out? Can we do a security evaluation call? Those types of things. Getting these micro commitments actually starts to get the organization marching in your same direction. So I hate to use the word weaponize, but I weaponize the ask for a proof of concept by turning it into a give get, right? Mick wants a proof of concept. Well, Mick, we can do that, but we do charge for our proofs of concept, and they're either 3 months or they're 6 months, and they're small. Maybe they're €1,000 or something per month, $1,000. But we want to get that commitment from you because we are putting our development resources and our implementation resources towards this project for you. We will absolutely work on proving the value.
Yeah.
However, we need something in exchange, and that's going to be a signed order form for a few $1,000s. And what I've done in some roles is you can actually structure a proof of concept order form that maybe says, we'll try it out for 90 days for $1,000. But then at the end of that 90-day period, assuming a successful program, we are going to roll this into a 12-month or a 3-year, whatever they're comfortable signing. And then you're going to be locked into our standard SaaS agreement, which is a residual recurring at X price. And you'd be surprised how tolerable that is, because most companies are like, yeah, that's fair if they do a really good job in the first 90 days and it works and they prove the value. We have no reason to not, roll that into a longer term contract. You can put some language in there that allows them an out if it's just absolutely not agreeable, but you can actually structure this and then build a process around delivering that value so that week over week, they're interacting with your team, they're, touching base with you as the seller, but they're also seeing how your company delivers. So yes, they're kind of they can slow down some of the bigger contracts, but if you lean into them the right way, you can actually end up, rolling those into a larger deal for yourself.
We're just pinging each other like me. No.
I was messaging Mick. I got a follow up. He was like, wait, I got a good follow up.
We'll let
Mick go because I'm holding.
I'll ask the question, and then if it's taking us away from the topic, then you can just add yours in between. But Jesse, it seems like you're natural, right? It sounds like you're naturally quite curious. You're well spoken. You can relate to different people issues. You can simplify what you're hearing into words that get understood at scale. How do you teach this to someone? Because we have a lot of people on the podcast. They speak about enablement. The last one we had was quite funny. You should have a listen. The state of enablement between managers, AEs, and then C-level, like whose responsibility is to structure the content. Where did you learn this? And if you learned that through experience, where do you feel you should have learned this skill set? And is it in line with your question, or is it more?
Well, no, it wasn't in line. So my question just requires a yes or no answer, to be honest. But just to add on to what you were saying about the proof of concept and proof of values, what's your view on adding a criteria into the actual order form or the agreement to say, okay, this is the definition of what a successful proof of concept looks like, right? That's the one bit, like, because I've done the same as you previously, where it's been like, hey, you do a 6-month proof of concept, you roll into the additional 12 months, but it's got to be binary. This is what success looks like. And if we tick these boxes, your agreement is you move into this 12, 24, 36-month agreement at this, at this price point.
Absolutely. You want to put very binary criteria in there, very black and white, almost like ironclad, if you will, criteria in there so that the prospects can read the language and say, I know what I'm agreeing to here. I am doing a proof of concept, but the give on their part is they know that that's going to roll into a longer term agreement. And then, you're mutually establishing what success looks like, which is going to set up the partnership in a great way. Because anytime you're in business with someone, whether it's an advertiser, you're selling a software deal, or even if you're working at purchasing a car or something like that, you really want to get the relationship off on the right foot. Hey, here's what I expect to be delivered. Here's what we're planning to deliver. It's all scoped out and documented here. So definitely, and for anyone listening, I'll share my contact details with the guys here. Reach out. I've got a template for this. If you're a startup out there that wants to know how to structure these, I actually have a template that I've used that's, 90-day proof of concept that rolls into an annual agreement. You'll have to do some modifications for your company, but it'll at least give you a visual example of what these could look like.
Nice. I like it. So we can
Mick,
put a bow under that now, Mick. You can you can go and move on to the next topic.
So the question, to simplify it, was who owns enablement? And did you learn that through enablement or experience?
A little bit of both. And I'm fortunate because I've worked for a lot of small companies, as I mentioned, that maybe didn't have the enablement resources as a bigger firm. So in that sense, a lot of my enablement was just in some ways being at the right place at the right time. So to take it a step back, I think a lot of it is going to come from within the seller, the rep. I'm a naturally curious person. I'm very passionate. I mentioned I studied, communications and journalism in school. So I haven't, I tend to gravitate towards writing and speaking and presenting and things like that. Those really have helped me a lot. Where I've closed a lot of gaps is, and I've actually talked about this a lot on social media. I love working from home. I'm a remote seller myself, but for the first, 5-6 years of my career, I was living in Austin, Texas, and I was working for early stage companies in office, in person. And in one such role, I actually sat next to our founder and CEO, which was you don't get experiences like that. Most people won't get that experience. It was better than any MBA program or any master's program in business because I was sitting next to someone who'd closed multiple 7-figure deals. I listened to the guy raise 7 figures in equity from outside investors. And again, just sitting 10 feet away or less from me, I heard all these conversations going down. And then it also opens itself up to these like very rare moments where he'd say something like, "Hey, Jesse, do you want to come sit in our board meeting? Just don't talk. We're on a conference line. No one's going to see you or anything. You can just be a fly on the wall and listen to how I interact with the board." And so some of those things I think really close the gap. So when I think about enablement, and I'm a big fan of there being a standardized enablement process in a company and a team and the tools and the resources to do it the right way. But the top reps will have to, in some ways, find ways to enable themselves. And that might be taking a role in person where you get to sit in the same office as your VP of sales or your CEO or your COO or whoever. It might be getting on site with your customers and trying to spend time in person, really understanding what your buyer does every single day. And that's another thing that I've forced myself to do. I actually just wrote a post about this, which is I tend to try to go and meet my customers on site whenever I can, because I learn a lot more about what their pain is when I can see them in person and have a, offhanded comment that's not over a Zoom call. You're going to get a lot more that way. So the answer is it's a little bit from within. I'm naturally curious, and that curiosity drives a lot of things like, hey, I'm going to take a job where I'll sit in a startup next to the founder, and I'm really curious what he talks about in the board meetings and some of those things. But so yeah, having great leaders is a big part of enablement. And I think what enablement organizations could do really well is enable the leadership to be better coaches to the reps. Because again, a lot of my learnings in my career came from someone who had just a decade plus of experience, or maybe 2 decades of experience closing large deals or managing enterprise engagements or launching something, right? And so I'm especially fortunate because I was in the right place and I was able to do a lot of these in-person interactions. But that's not to say in 2024, if you're a remote seller or you're a remote enablement team, that there's not still access to all kinds of great tools and technology to allow you to enable your team to have some of those same types of experiences.
Yeah, that's really good. It's really hard. When I was leading a team back in the day, and the team was made of SDRs promoted into a closing role for the first time. And allegedly, the pressure was much higher on this little SMB team that it was on the enterprise and the strategic team, because there was a cadence they needed to follow. And then if you were not booking new revenue every month at that level within a specific date, within specific timelines, then automatic PIP, kind of this kind of setup. And they're also exposed to C-level stakeholders much faster in the sales cycle, buying cycle than someone in enterprise or strategic sales would be, right? Because you've got a year and a half ahead of you, and these guys, second meeting on, hey, you need to speak to my CFO, you need to speak to my CEO. These guys are also like burning under pressure. So like those conversations are really, really tricky. None of the enablement was ever made around what does a CFO in a startup company speak about, worries about, what does a CEO in a startup company speaks about, worry about. All the enablement was made about, have you done your security questionnaire? Have you, this is how you do your systems updates and so on and so forth. Like, what's the ratio? Like how much, and we spoke to Dustin Brown as well on the podcast, he was saying exactly like you, is you enable yourself. If you want to get to that next level, you go and find information. How do you manage that when you've got a full-time job, which probably requires more than just the full-time requirements to get good at, plus the internal enablement, plus your podcast? Like, what's the magic here?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can be really overwhelming sometimes. And by the way, Dustin Brown, shout out. He's one of the best in the industry. He actually trained me on a lot of these things. I've told this story, I've told this story a handful of times that he was my new hire partner. He had been on board at the company for a while, and I joined a company in an enterprise selling role. And at the time I was living in Austin, Texas. He's in Dallas, Texas. So I actually drove up and spent a week with him going around and getting, like, again, better than an MBA, a boot camp in enterprise sales. So back to my comment earlier, like I've just been really fortunate that I've happened to bump into some of these people that are just real shakers and movers, like Dustin, I mentioned earlier, like being in a startup where you have access to the CEO and you can just pick that person's brain. So how do you balance it all? You have to really, one of the things that someone told me earlier in my career, a CRO I worked for, said, sales is a lifestyle. It's not a career. And I'll say it again. Sales is a lifestyle, not a career. What did he mean by that? I've thought about it for years. This is probably 7 years ago that I heard him say this to me in a one-on-one. And I've thought about it every year for years, right? I think about it all the time. What it means is if you get into a profession in selling, it's not just a career. It's really not just a 9 to 5. It's because you're the kind of person that is gravitating towards solving problems and building something and, driving personal wealth and some of those different things. It's more of a personality than it is like a job or a career. And so you have to be the kind of person that is going to make time for development, self-enablement, as Dustin put it. And so you find ways to do it. And I think a great way to do it, there's so much content out there now. There's so many great people you can follow on social media that talk about this stuff. There's so many great podcasts like this one that you can tune into. There's books, there's Audible, there's all kinds of different things and ways to do it. And I'll tell you, one of the ways that I did it was 4 years ago, I decided to launch my own podcast. And the show is Sales Players. At the time, it was called SaaS Sales Players. And my goal for that was to interview the top pros in the industry. And I've had dozens of really amazing conversations with some of the top performing sellers in the world, I think. I mean, these are people that you probably know their names from LinkedIn and from other places. Dustin was an early guest on the show. And so I've been very fortunate because it allowed me to sort of pick their brains and say, what is Dustin doing that I'm not, that I should be doing? Or what is Jamal Reimer doing? He shares a lot of his stuff, but I had Jamal on the show a while ago, right? And so it was just a chance for me to continue to level up. You don't have to go out and start a podcast to become great at this stuff, but put yourself out there, really put yourself out there. And again, some ways to do that is if you're sitting in a remote role right now and you're not feeling like you're achieving the results you want to achieve, or you're doing the things you want to do in your career, take a role in person if you can. I know it sounds counterintuitive. Everybody wants to be remote. Me too. But if you're feeling stagnant in your growth, try to find a place where you can get in person more often. If you can't do that, try to join, a meetup or something. There's probably a sales meetup or something in your area. Do that. If you have customers that are local, try to get in person with your customers or your prospects, because you'll also learn a lot about what you sell and how it impacts these companies if you go on site and spend time there. So you have to look for these these opportunities. You have to keep both eyes open and say, hey, this person lives 20 minutes away from me. I should reach out and see if they want to go grab coffee or happy hour at the pub, just some way to get in person with my buyer so that I can learn a little bit more about what's in it for them. Right. And that's a big part of how I sell. Is it's never about just, it is about like solving the pain and those sorts of things. But a lot of times decisions get made because a buyer says, this will move our organization in the, right direction tenfold, right? Or this will really accelerate our growth or whatever it is. And so you as the seller need to get into that, headspace of how does this, what's in it for the people that I'm working with. Yeah. So hopefully that answers the question, but it's, you've got to find the time. You've got to commit, yourself to reading and listening and watching, whatever content will help get you there. And then my, extra advice beyond that is like, get yourself out there whenever you can, even if it means putting some of your own money into this. One of the ways I think about a sales career, again, back to the fact that it's not a career, it's a lifestyle, is you should probably run your career in sales like a founder would run a startup. And what that means for me is that I put, my own skin in the game. My own capital sometimes goes into flying out. I went actually last fall out to Outreach's conference in Seattle with Dustin at the time. And so I put, probably over $1,000 in hotels and airfare and those things to fly from where I'm at to Seattle. I'm doing that again here in a couple of weeks. I'm going out back east in the United States to a startup conference. So I put my own money into this in my own sense. I'm investing in my own self. And I think a lot of people get scared when they hear that because they think, well, I don't want to spend $1,000 on a sales training course or on a tool or on a trip or something like that. And I'm here to say it will absolutely pay dividends if it's the right thing. If you've done the research and it's an event where you're going to network and meet people, or it's a customer conference, or if it's something that's going to put you at an advantage, then you should do it. You'll earn it back tenfold. And these are investments in yourself. They're probably some of the best investments you can make, especially early on in your career.
Yeah, absolutely. I also know of people who've directly reached out to people on LinkedIn that they don't know, just like a cold message saying, hey, you're 5 years further down the road than I want to be. Are you willing to spend some time with me? And you'd be very surprised at how many people are willing to give back to the community as well. So it's great advice there.
I've got a great story about that. So I mentioned that I launched my show, SaaS Sales Players. It's now called Sales Players, back in 2020. And in, I think, 2022, a guy named Chase Barmore reached out to me on LinkedIn. He was in Kentucky, which is not, necessarily a huge tech place. There's not a lot of tech jobs in the middle of the United States. They're kind of concentrated in the coastal cities. So he reached out and said, hey, I'm a big fan of your podcast. He didn't know what SaaS was. He didn't know what that meant. He went and typed SaaS into iTunes or Apple Podcasts, and my show came up. And so he started listening and learning about the industry. He was someone who had just sold off a consumer company that he was doing, like a hospitality business that he was running, and was looking for his next career move. So over the course of several months, he started paying me for coaching, just how to get a role in SaaS sales. And we were working together. And then after that ended, he landed a SaaS job, but just kept delivering value. Like we stood up a Slack channel for our fans of the podcast, or for my fans of the podcast. And he was kind of like the de facto like moderator in the Slack community, just doing it for, I didn't ask him to do this, but just adding a ton of value. And he totally just reached out to me cold on LinkedIn. Now, fast forward to today, he is my co-host on the podcast now. And we co-owned the company behind it, and we split the profits. It's pretty crazy that, one LinkedIn DM from someone who at the time didn't even really fully understand the software business is now, first of all, he's a very successful account executive in a software company today. And he's now my co-host and partner in the business, which is pretty exciting. So don't hesitate. If you have this kind of gut instinct to say, hey, I'm going to reach out to this person. Maybe they run a podcast or a YouTube channel. Maybe there's someone who posts on LinkedIn. Just give it a try. And he is like the Michael Jordan of reaching out to people on LinkedIn and getting them to respond. The biggest guests on the show have come from him just shooting someone a DM, either in a Slack community that he's in or in a LinkedIn, and them saying, yeah, sure, I'll go on your show. And that's been huge.
Amazing. A quick question. Earlier on, you referenced the pub. Was that because we're in the UK? Was that you adapted?
I'm adapted. Yeah. I'm kind of a chameleon. And you caught me because one of my favorite books of all time is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss.
Yes, love that book.
And a principle that he talks about is mirroring. So I am a like compulsive mirrorer. So if I'm talking to someone in the UK, I was trying to convert the dollars to pounds or whatever.
The euro, yeah.
I think I said euros instead of pounds, but that's on me. And then I'll say pub instead of bar. I was talking to someone the other week, and I said cheers to them, which I wouldn't normally say cheers to someone who's in California, but he was
Amazing.
in the UK, so I said, "Hey, cheers, mate."
So, well spotted. And good adaptation. It's one of my friends used to say, if you can adapt, you're probably one of the most clever guy out there. It's all about adaptation.
Exactly.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned not making that much money from acquisitions, and I think there's, especially in the SaaS startup world, there's often a trade-off between, hey, I'm gonna give you a job. It's not well paid, but you got a lot of equity, and actually it's even worse paid, but I'll give you even more equity. Like, do you take the equity, gamble it, or do you say, actually, screw the equity, I just want my high basic?
This is a good question for me because I have a lot of really strong thoughts on this. Early in my career, I was, all bought in, drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak. It was, oh, cool, I can join this company. I joined a startup in Austin years and years ago, and they were convinced they were going to be the next Twitter. And they paid me way less than I was worth, but it was this, big fat
equity.
And guess what? Everybody who invested in that company ended up having to pay taxes on all that here in the States. And the company sold for 2x revenue. So not a good exit for anyone who doesn't understand SaaS multiples. You want to try to be 7, 8, 9, 10, or 15x revenue, right? Or 15 times revenue to get your money back. This company fire sold. In other words, they sold for significantly less than they should have. And all of my colleagues who vested those shares ended up on the hook for the taxes on those, even though they never made anything on it. So fortunately, I avoided that because I started to kind of smell the bullshit there, and decided not to vest those shares. But just after that experience, I got kind of jaded to the whole equity thing. Actually, I had one more experience after that where I got a letter, years later saying your shares are zero. The company had to settle this and pay off the investors. So here's how sellers can think about this. And Corey Bray, if you follow him on LinkedIn, wrote an amazing article about this years and years ago. And I always send people back to this blog piece, and I can drop it so you guys can share it in the show notes. Basically, if you're a seller in an early stage company, you're going to get screwed on equity. The only people that really make life-changing money in startups are the founders, the owners of the business, or the investors, people that put their own skin in the game. And that's just the way it is. And that's probably not going to change in anyone's lifetime. And it's just kind of the nature of the beast. I say that as someone who had a decent exit when, when the company I was working for was purchased by a big FANG company. That was a pretty nice exit, but nothing, life-changing. So what I tell sellers to do now when they bring their, a lot of times in my coaching, someone will bring me an offer letter and I review that for them. That's part of my services. And I'll say, don't focus so much on negotiating equity because it's just not a sure thing. It's a piece of paper until it's not. Yeah. And, focus more on trying to negotiate the best base salary you can get, the best comp plan you can get. And then, maybe there's some other benefits in there, like a separation agreement or something at the end if things don't work out. That's probably more valuable than equity for a lot of people is, hey, if this startup doesn't work out, I want a 6-month severance package at the back end or a signing bonus for $10,000, right? So those kind of things could end up being, cash is really king. I still believe that. And if you're in the right role where you're able to put that cash into, buying stock at some other company like Apple or Meta or wherever, like that's probably going to be more valuable for you than holding a bunch of paper in a company that you have no control over the outcome. You have no idea. I think Jason Limkin always says it takes at least 10 years for a SaaS company. Probably in this environment, it's more like 15 years for a SaaS company to go through an exit. So unless you're planning to stay on for 15 years and climb the ranks, it's really, kind of a crapshoot, and you're not likely to make a significant amount of money from it. Where you can make a lot of money in startup sales is if you reel in that company's first 7-figure client and you're paid at a 12, 13, 14, 15% commission rate, that's a pretty good chunk of cash. And that's where I've made most of my money. Is I've been early in sales and been one of the first to bring in a, you know, high 6-figure, 7-figure deal at a 12% or 15% commission rate. And that has put cash in my pocket, which I can then just go put into the S&P 500 here in the States. And it's a more of a long-term, you know, growth investment. So short answer, don't get too hung up on it unless you're, you know, joining as a co-founder or a partner in the business, or unless you're an investor in the company yourself. It's, you know, it's not a likely outcome at this point. I think it's getting harder and harder too, because there's just less exits. I mean, a few years ago, there was a lot of SaaS exits. A lot of companies were selling to Salesforce or whatever, and people were making some money. But in this environment, I would imagine most individual contributor sellers should just focus on trying to make as much cash as they can.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a trick you get played on when you're new to the industry. I've had friends who've been acquired. They've been acquired. They sold their stock as part of the acquisition. They didn't even realize they made money from the acquisition. That was the amount was so low. Yeah, it's painful because it's not just the weight. It's more about, it's harder, I think, in my opinion, to work for a startup than it is for a bigger company. You can't hide, more pressure, people see what you're doing, and so on and so forth. All right, Jesse, can we move on and say you're running a very successful podcast?
Mm-hmm.
And again, like kind of self-made, like using your attributes to be successful. And I think there's a lot of people now on the internet trying to build their own brand. We see this on LinkedIn. What's your advice for someone who's starting, doesn't have the reach you have, or doesn't have a podcast, doesn't have the confidence to speak about something specific to start with? How do you get started to build your own brand and then move on like this, the ranks?
Great question. And I'm probably not the best person to ask, because I put, you know, half of my attention, like I don't put that much thought into things on, you know, when it comes to content creation anymore. I really just try to share stories that are true, that happened to me, and examples. That's it. That's the best thing that I've done. I definitely don't create every day. Like I don't post every day on social. I'm pretty sporadic about it. But yeah, let me tell you what someone told me years ago before I launched the podcast. I really wanted to do something. I felt like this internal call that said, I need to create, not just sell, but I need to actually create something, a product, a brand. And so I really had this desire, and podcasting was one of the things that I consumed a ton of. I'm a huge pod listener, listen to a bunch of different shows, still do. Not as much on YouTube, but I will turn on, you know, Spotify or iTunes or Apple and just stream shows. So podcasting seemed like the right way to go. But I was so scared. At first I wanted to start a show about some other topic completely away from sales and business. But I was talking to a guy who had already had a successful show. He actually had posted on LinkedIn and said, hey, if anybody ever wants to launch a podcast, I'm doing, you know, free coaching on how to do that. And so I took him up on it. And I said, I'm really scared to launch a sales show because there's like a million sales shows. What am I adding to the conversation? Nobody wants to hear another voice in sales. It's such a saturated topic. And he said, well, nobody else has had your specific experiences. So as long as you just tell your stories with your point of view, from your experiences, no one can reproduce that elsewhere. And that is different. That is a unique, you know, identifier for your show. And so that's kind of how I got the courage to launch my own thing, was if I just tell my own stories, no matter what, if nobody listens or nobody looks at the post or shares it or anything like that, at the very least, it's a journal. It's a way for me to jot down my thoughts or share my thoughts on the, you know, broadcast my thoughts in some way. And I'm very proud of that, because when I launched the show, I just didn't care. I didn't care about who. I thought maybe my wife would listen and my mom would listen, and I would be happy with that. And sure enough, after a few weeks of launching the show, I started to see the download numbers go up. And I was like, well, there's definitely people out there tuning into this besides just mom and my wife, right? So I kept going, and you just keep going. I really, you know, had committed to doing a few episodes. Dustin was one of those early episodes, and I thought, this doesn't work out, it's pretty easy to just unplug this and turn it off. But here we are 4 years later. I actually can't believe that I'm still doing it 4 years later. We have one of the biggest guests in the history of the show coming on Friday, who's I'll tease it out a little bit for anyone who's a fan of the show. We've got a really big sales coach and author who's written tons of very, prominent books in the category coming on the show on Friday. So I cannot believe that if I had a time machine and I went back to 2020 and I told myself that I was going to have the caliber of guests on the program that I have now, I would have been, just in awe. So my advice here is start doing something, but try to think of it as, hey, I'm posting on LinkedIn, or I'm posting on X, or I'm doing a podcast, or I'm doing a YouTube channel for myself. This is my journal to document some of my wins, some of my learnings, some of my perspectives on things. And that's it. Don't have any expectations. Just imagine that only your mom's going to listen to it, and that's it. And you'll be surprised that authenticity will actually lend itself to a lot of people saying, hey, I like this person. They share what's real. It's raw, right? People want to hear raw behind the scenes. I think that's why if you follow Scott Leese out there, one of the reasons I like his content is he's very raw. He tells things, he says things in a way that most people won't say it because it's just less polished. It feels very real. And then another test that you should run as an early content creator is, especially like with a podcast, and you guys probably did some flavor of this, which is when you look at those early download numbers, or even if you have a post on LinkedIn or a newsletter or something, just look at those early numbers and envision, and what if those people showed up at my house right now? Because sometimes it's really easy in the early days to go, I only got 150 listens on this episode. That sucks. But then if you imagined 150 people knocking on your door right now saying, hey, Mick, I want to come in and hear about your content, you'd probably get the police called on you because people would say, why are 150 people pouring into this house? So I use that trick, which in the early days, I'd feel like throwing in the towel and giving up. And I'd say, I got 200 people listening to this. That sucks. Joe Rogan has 100,000 people listening to every episode or whatever it is, probably more than that. How can I ever get there? Right. But then I would stop and say, if 150 or 200 people showed up in my living room right now, there wouldn't be room for all those people to listen to me talk about sales.
Yeah.
So as you're creating content, just try to remind yourself like how crazy it is that we live in a world where you can post on LinkedIn and get 5,000 impressions. If those 5,000 people showed up on your street, it would be wild, right? So just remember that. And it's also not about the numbers. It's really about you articulating your thoughts, writing them down, sharing your experiences. Someday you'll at the very least look back at it and say, hey, I had a pretty cool career.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And just one last comment. Don't give up early as well. I think a lot of people have seen that. I'll hand over to Hits after that, but they do 2 episodes, 3 episodes, and they're like, it's just not catching. And I'm like, well, yeah, like we're at episode 55. Like we're not successful because we were successful episode 5. We're successful because there's 55 episodes people can skip through now, and it compounds. Awesome.
Absolutely. Jesse, it's been great to have you on. And I feel like the wrap-up question is going to be quite difficult for you because you've had some great experiences. But the question is, through your whole career to date, what is your favorite memory and why?
Yeah, that's a great one. And that's hard. There's a lot of them. But I'll go back to that same experience I mentioned earlier on the show, which is had this opportunity to join a startup in Austin where I was in this very small office space sitting with the, VP of customer success and the CEO and a whole team of sellers and a whole team of developers. And whenever I think about, the period of my career where I learned the most and was having the most fun and was just sort of treasuring every single day going into work. And I shouldn't say every day. No one lives every day in complete, bliss, right? There's always going to be fires to put out and shit shows and things like that. But those were, when I look back at those, I think about those really fondly. It was early in my career. I was younger, and had a lot of energy, a lot of drive, just was so wildly curious about everything. And just felt like I had a group of people around me that were also wanting all of those same things. And someday I want to recreate that with my own company. I want to have, that same level of energy where maybe I'm the person in charge or the leader that can facilitate that for people that are earlier on in their career. But that is, one of my best memories was just Friday afternoons, cracking open a cold Shiner beer, which is a, you know, very popular beer in Texas, and just sitting with the CEO and picking his brain about stocks and equity and deals and all kinds of stuff, and having everybody just kind of sit there and riff on ideas and talk about what they were going to do the next week to level the business up. So I look back on those times pretty fondly. Again, I've tried to recreate some of those things as a remote seller. And then one of the ways that we try to create that community is with sales players. We've got a Slack channel. We try to do meetups with people and infuse some of the same energy. It's not quite the same because, you know, I'm not an exited founder who's done this, you know, 10 times and sold companies and gone public and all those things, but we can still kind of get everybody's juices flowing and get, you know, some fun, creative energy and collaboration. But yeah, that was almost a decade ago in that role. So, or it was a decade ago. I'm getting old. And it was a great experience for my career and really pivotal for me. When I look back, I think that's when things really started to click in. That's when I felt almost like I could do anything, right? You know, if normal people around me can run this great company and, you know, have this kind of success, I can do that too.
Absolutely. Great answer, Jesse, as I expected it would be. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, I think we could record another 5-6 episodes with you. You've got so many great stories to share. So thank you for joining us. This has been the Revenue Revolution podcast, sponsored by Jointflows. Until next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.